A week after I moved into the house, I finally felt like I could breathe again, like the weight that had been sitting on my chest for years had loosened just enough to let air in without hurting. And for the first time in a long time, silence didn't feel suffocating, it felt peaceful, almost healing, as if the walls themselves understood what I had been through and promised not to echo the past back at me. And maybe that's why I chose this place in the first place, not because it was perfect or modern or even particularly beautiful, but because it was quiet, tucked away on a street where nobody asked questions and nobody looked too closely. A place where I could disappear and rebuild myself piece by fragile piece after everything that had happened with Ollie, after the lies that started small and harmless and grew into something sharp and unbearable. After the nights I spent convincing myself that love wasn't supposed to feel like fear and yet staying anyway because leaving felt even more terrifying, until one day it didn't, until one day the fear of staying finally outweighed the fear of leaving and I packed my things with shaking hands and walked out without looking back, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of cracks I didn't know how to fix, and this house was supposed to be the beginning of that repair, a blank space where no one knew my story and no one could rewrite it for me, where I could wake up without checking my phone for accusations, where I could sit in the living room without feeling watched, without feeling judged, without feeling like every move I made needed permission, and for 7 days it worked, for 7 quiet, almost unreal days I lived like I belonged to myself again, cooking simple meals, leaving books open on the table, falling asleep on the couch with the television humming softly in the background, letting the normalcy wrap around me like something I had forgotten I deserved, and maybe that's why the phone call felt so wrong the moment it came, slicing through that fragile sense of peace like it had no right to exist in my new life, the screen lighting up with an unknown number that I stared at longer than I should have, debating whether to answer or let it fade into nothing like the rest of the past I was trying so hard to bury, but something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. A quiet instinct that whispered this wasn't random, that this call carried something I wouldn't be able to ignore. And against my better judgment I answered, pressing the phone to my ear with a soft, cautious hello that felt too small for what was about to follow, and the voice on the other end was calm, almost apologetic, introducing himself as Daniel, the previous owner of the house, his tone polite but edged with hesitation as if he wasn't sure how to say what he needed to say. And I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as I listened, my body going still in that instinctive way it used to. Whenever something felt off, whenever I sensed trouble before it fully revealed itself, and when he finally spoke again, when he said he thought he had forgotten to disconnect the living room camera, the words didn't make sense at first, they just floated there in the space between us, disconnected and unreal, like my mind refused to process them. And I asked him to repeat himself because surely I had misunderstood, surely there wasn't a hidden camera in the house I had been living in for a week, surely I hadn't been unknowingly watched in the one place I believed was safe, but he said it again, slower this time, clearer, each word landing heavier than the last, explaining that it was part of an old security system, small and easy to miss, positioned near the bookshelf, still connected to his account, still active, and I felt something inside me drop, a cold, hollow sensation spreading through my chest as my thoughts began to race, every moment from the past week flashing through my mind in sharp, uncomfortable fragments, the way I walked around in loose clothes, the way I talked to myself when the silence felt too loud, the way I let my guard down because I thought I was alone, truly alone. And the realization that I hadn't been, that someone could have been watching without my knowledge, made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't shake. And my voice came out sharper than I intended when I asked him how he could forget something like that, how he could leave something so invasive behind without telling me, and he apologized quickly, almost too quickly, insisting it wasn't intentional, that he hadn't accessed the system since selling the house, that he only noticed because the device showed up as still active when he logged in earlier that day, and there was something about the way he said it that made my stomach twist. Not entirely distrustful but not entirely reassuring either, because the damage was already done, the trust already broken in a place where trust had just begun to grow again, and then he said something that shifted everything from unsettling to terrifying. He said he hadn't checked the footage until today, and the implication of that statement hung heavy in the air, making my breath hitch as I realized that meant he had seen something recent, something that made him call me instead of quietly disconnecting the device and moving on. And when I asked him what he meant, when I forced the question past the dryness in my throat, his answer came with a pause that felt too long, too deliberate, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, losing its casual tone and taking on a seriousness that made my pulse spike. And he told me I needed to check the footage, that there was something I had to see, and in that moment every sense inside me sharpened. Every instinct screaming that whatever waited on those recordings was not something I was prepared for, not something that would leave my fragile sense of safety intact. And I glanced around the living room then, really looked at it for the first time since the call began, at the bookshelf he had mentioned, at the corners I hadn't paid attention to before, at the shadows that suddenly seemed deeper than they had any right to be, and the house that had felt like a sanctuary only minutes ago now felt unfamiliar, almost hostile, like it was hiding something just out of sight, and my heart pounded as I took a slow step toward the bookshelf, my eyes scanning every inch until I saw it, a small dark shape tucked between the decor, barely noticeable unless you knew it was there, and the moment I recognized it for what it was, a camera quietly observing a life that wasn't meant to be seen, a shiver ran down my spine that I couldn't suppress, because deep down I knew this wasn't just about being watched, this was about something far worse, something that connected the past I had tried to escape with the present I thought I had secured, and as Daniel's voice continued softly through the phone, urging me to stay calm and check the recordings, I realized with a growing sense of dread that whatever I was about to uncover wasn't going to let me stay hidden anymore, that the life I had just begun to rebuild was already being pulled back into the shadows I thought I had left behind. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the phone still pressed to my ear as Daniel guided me through the process of accessing the camera system, but his voice felt distant now, like it was coming from somewhere far away, muffled by the pounding of my own heartbeat, because all I could focus on was the small black lens hidden near the bookshelf, the quiet, lifeless object that had been watching me without my knowledge, recording every moment of my supposed safety, and my hands trembled as I reached for it, unplugging it from the wall with a sharp pull that felt more desperate than controlled, as if cutting the power would somehow erase what had already been captured, but deep down I knew it wouldn't. Nothing would undo the fact that for an entire week I had been exposed, vulnerable in a place I trusted, and when I sat down with my laptop, following Daniel's instructions step by step, logging into the old system he still had access to, my fingers hesitated over the keyboard, a wave of dread washing over me so intensely that for a moment I considered shutting it all down and pretending none of this existed, pretending I never answered that call, pretending the past wasn't reaching into my present once again, but something stronger pushed me forward, something that refused to stay in the dark any longer, and so I clicked on the footage, holding my breath as the screen flickered to life, revealing the familiar view of my living room from an angle I had never seen before. And there I was, moving through the space as if nothing was wrong, unaware of the silent observer capturing my every step, and at first it felt almost surreal, watching myself exist from the outside, like I was looking at a stranger who just happened to wear my face, someone who smiled faintly while making tea, who sat curled up on the couch scrolling through her phone, who tried to rebuild a life piece by piece without realizing she was never truly alone, and I felt a strange mix of embarrassment and anger as I watched those moments play out, intimate in a way they were never meant to be shared, but still harmless, still normal, and for a brief second I almost believed maybe this was all it was, an invasion of privacy but nothing more, something I could report, something I could move past, until Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts again, telling me to scroll further, to check the late-night recordings, his tone more serious now, heavier, and my stomach tightened as I followed his instruction, skipping through hours of footage until the timestamps shifted to the early hours of the morning, 2:13 a.m., 2:47 a.m., 3:02 a.m., times when I had been asleep, completely unaware of anything happening beyond my bedroom door, and that's when I saw it, the moment that changed everything, the living room dark and still, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the curtains, and at first nothing seemed out of place, just silence stretching across the frame, until suddenly the front door moved, slowly, almost cautiously, the handle turning with deliberate care before the door opened just enough to let someone slip inside, and my breath caught so sharply it hurt, my entire body going rigid as I leaned closer to the screen, hoping, desperately hoping that what I was seeing wasn't real, that it was some kind of glitch or shadow or trick of the light, but then the figure stepped fully into view, and the truth hit me like a blow I wasn't prepared for, because I knew that posture, that height, the way he carried himself like he owned every space he entered, I knew it before his face even became visible, and when it did, when the dim light revealed his features clearly enough to erase all doubt, my heart dropped into a hollow, aching void. Ollie, it was Ollie, standing in my living room as if nothing had changed, as if I had never left, as if the distance I put between us meant nothing at all, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even process how he could be there, how he could have found me, how he could have entered a house that was supposed to be mine, safe and untouched by everything he represented. And I felt my grip tighten painfully around the edge of the table as I kept watching, unable to look away even though every instinct told me to shut it off, to escape the reality unfolding on the screen. But I didn't. I couldn't, because I needed to understand, needed to know what he was doing there, needed to see how far this had gone, and the footage continued, showing him stepping further into the room. His movements slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the space with a familiarity that made my skin crawl, like he was memorizing it, like he was claiming it, and then he stopped in the center of the room, just standing there, still and silent, and the way he looked around made it feel less like he had broken in and more like he was waiting for something or someone, and that realization sent a chill down my spine that I couldn't shake, because it meant this wasn't random, this wasn't curiosity, this was intentional, planned. And my mind raced back to every moment of our past, every warning sign I had ignored. Every time his love felt more like control than care, every time I convinced myself that his intensity meant he cared deeply when in reality it meant he couldn't let go, and now here he was, proving that leaving him hadn't been enough to break whatever hold he believed he had over me, and I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from a rising anger that burned hotter with every passing second. Because this wasn't just about fear anymore, it was about violation, about him stepping into my life again without permission, about him refusing to accept that I had chosen to walk away. And as the footage continued, I watched him move around the room, touching things, opening drawers, running his fingers along surfaces as if searching for traces of me, and I realized with a sickening clarity that he wasn't just visiting, he was investigating, looking for signs, for clues, for anything that could tell him where I was, what I was doing, who I had become without him. And when he paused near the couch, the very spot where I had sat just hours earlier, I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, imagining how close we had come to crossing paths without me even knowing how easily I could have walked into the living room and found him there, and the thought alone made my chest tighten painfully, because the line between safety and danger had been thinner than I ever realized, and I hadn't even seen it. And Daniel's voice broke through again, quieter now, almost cautious, asking me if I recognized him. And I couldn't even bring myself to answer right away, because saying his name out loud felt like giving him power again, like acknowledging that he still had a place in my life when all I wanted was to erase him completely. But eventually the word slipped out in a whisper, barely audible, Ollie, and even hearing it made my stomach twist, because it carried too many memories, too much pain, too many unanswered questions about how things had gone so wrong. And as I kept watching, as the footage showed him lingering a little longer before finally leaving the same way he came, slipping out into the night as quietly as he entered, I felt something inside me shift, something subtle but undeniable, because the fear that had gripped me at first was still there, still heavy and real, but beneath it something else was growing, something sharper, something steadier, a realization that this wasn't over, that whatever connection he believed still existed between us hadn't been broken by distance alone, and if I wanted my life back, truly back, I couldn't just hide and hope he would disappear, because clearly he wouldn't. Clearly he had already crossed lines I never thought he would. And as the screen went dark and the footage ended, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the black display, I understood with a quiet, unsettling certainty that the past I had tried so hard to escape had found me again, and this time it wasn't going to let me go without a fight. I couldn't stop staring at the blank screen after the footage ended, my reflection faintly staring back at me as if I didn't fully recognize the person I had become in that moment, someone caught between fear and something far more dangerous, something that had been building quietly inside me for years without ever finding a voice. And as Daniel's concerned voice echoed through the phone telling me to stay calm, to call the police immediately, to not take any risks, I realized that for the first time I wasn't reacting the way I used to, because the girl who once panicked, who once cried and begged and tried to reason with someone who thrived on control, she wasn't the one sitting here anymore. Instead, there was a strange stillness settling over me, a clarity that cut through the chaos of my thoughts and forced me to see everything exactly as it was, not softened by denial or blurred by emotion, but sharp and undeniable. And in that clarity, every memory of Ollie came rushing back. Not the carefully edited versions I used to hold onto to justify staying with him, not the moments where he smiled or apologized or made me believe things could change, but the truth I had buried beneath all of that, the truth of how he slowly dismantled my independence piece by piece until I barely recognized myself, how he questioned every decision I made, every person I spoke to, every place I went, turning concern into surveillance and affection into ownership until I no longer knew the difference. And I remembered the nights I sat quietly while he scrolled through my phone, the way he would laugh it off when I protested, telling me I was overreacting, that he just cared too much, that love meant knowing everything about each other, and I had believed him because it was easier than accepting that what I was experiencing wasn't love at all. It was control wrapped in sweet words and empty promises. And now, as I replayed the footage in my mind, watching him move through my living room like he still had a right to be there, I felt that illusion shatter completely, because there was no denying it anymore, no excuse, no misunderstanding. He hadn't changed. He hadn't let go. If anything, he had become more dangerous, more desperate, and the realization didn't break me the way it once would have. It didn't send me spiraling into panic or self-doubt. Instead, it ignited something fierce and unyielding inside my chest, something that refused to be small or silent any longer, and I stood up slowly, pacing the room as my thoughts began to organize themselves into something purposeful, something that felt less like reaction and more like intention. Because for the first time I wasn't thinking about how to escape him, I was thinking about how to stop him, how to make sure he never had the chance to step into my life again. And when Daniel repeated that I needed to report this, that what I saw was illegal, that I was in danger, I finally responded, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, telling him I understood, that I would handle it. But even as I said the words, I knew I wasn't going to follow the path he expected. Not immediately, not blindly, because something told me that simply calling the police now would only scratch the surface of what Ollie had done, that it would address this one incident but not the pattern, not the obsession driving it, and I needed more than that. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed, evidence that showed exactly who he was beneath the mask he wore so well in front of others. And as that thought took hold, my fear began to reshape itself into something sharper, something controlled. And I walked back to the bookshelf, staring at the camera I had unplugged, realizing that the very thing that had violated my privacy could now become the tool that protected me, that exposed him. And the irony of it almost made me laugh, a quiet, humorless sound that echoed in the otherwise silent room, because for so long I had been the one caught off guard, the one reacting to his actions, the one trying to keep up with a game I didn't even realize I was playing. But now the roles had shifted in a way he couldn't see yet, and that gave me an advantage I had never had before, and I picked up the camera slowly, turning it over in my hands as I considered my options, my mind already mapping out possibilities, scenarios, outcomes, each one leading me closer to a sense of control I had been denied for far too long. And as I stood there, I remembered the last conversation I had with him before I left, the way he looked at me with that unsettling calm, telling me I would come back, that I always did, that I didn't know how to exist without him. And at the time those words had shaken me, planted seeds of doubt that took weeks to fully pull out, but now they only fueled my determination. Because he was wrong, so completely and undeniably wrong, and I was about to prove it in a way he would never forget. And as I moved through the house, checking the locks, the windows, every possible entry point, I felt a sense of awareness settle over me. A heightened alertness that made every sound sharper, every shadow more defined, not out of fear but out of readiness, because I knew he would come back. The footage made that clear. This wasn't a one-time act of curiosity. It was a pattern, a habit, something he believed he could continue without consequence, and that certainty became the foundation of my plan, because if he thought he could return whenever he wanted, then all I had to do was let him believe it a little longer, just enough to catch him in a way he couldn't escape. And when Daniel asked if I wanted him to disable the system remotely, to make sure no one could access it again, I surprised both of us by saying no, my voice firm, almost calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the storm of thoughts behind it, because disabling it would mean losing the opportunity to gather more evidence, more proof of what was happening, and I needed that, not just for the authorities but for myself, for the closure I never got, for the validation that I hadn't imagined the toxicity of what we had, that it was real and it was dangerous and it was over. And as I ended the call, thanking him for telling me even though part of me resented the situation he had unknowingly left behind, I felt a strange sense of gratitude as well, because without that call I might have remained unaware, vulnerable in ways I couldn't protect myself from, and now at least I knew, now I could act. And as I sat down once more, the camera resting on the table in front of me, I took a deep breath and let the reality of everything settle fully into place, letting the fear exist without letting it control me, letting the anger burn without letting it consume me. And in that balance I found something I hadn't felt in a long time, something steady and grounding and powerful, the certainty that I was no longer the person he thought I was, no longer the girl who would shrink under his gaze or bend under his pressure. And as that certainty took root, it transformed into resolve, into a quiet promise to myself that this time would be different, that this time I wouldn't just survive what he did, I would end it, completely and permanently. And as the night stretched on around me, silent but no longer peaceful, I began to plan not out of desperation but out of intention, every detail forming carefully in my mind, every step bringing me closer to reclaiming the control he once stole from me. And by the time the first hint of dawn touched the edges of the sky, I knew exactly what I was going to do, and more importantly, I knew I wasn't afraid anymore. The house felt different that night, not unsafe, not unfamiliar, but charged with a quiet tension that hummed beneath every sound, every movement, as if it knew something was about to happen and was holding its breath along with me, and I moved through it with a calm I had never known before, double-checking every detail of my plan, every angle of the room, every placement of the camera I had carefully reconnected and positioned exactly where it had been before so nothing would seem out of place, because if Ollie suspected even the slightest change, he might not come back, and I needed him to come back, not for confrontation born out of anger, but for something far more controlled, far more final. And as I sat on the couch, the same couch he had stood beside in the footage, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me, not as fear but as awareness, because this was the turning point, the moment where everything I had endured, everything I had learned, would either break me again or set me free completely, and I refused to let it be the first, and so I waited, the hours stretching slowly, the ticking of the clock louder than usual, each passing minute sharpening my focus instead of wearing it down, until finally, just past 2 in the morning, it happened, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of the front door handle turning, so soft it could have been mistaken for imagination if I hadn't been listening for it, and my body stilled instantly, every sense alert, every nerve steady, as I watched from my position in the dimly lit room, not moving, not reacting, letting him believe for just a moment longer that he was still the one in control. And the door opened slowly, just as it had in the footage, careful and deliberate, and he stepped inside, his silhouette familiar against the darkness, his presence heavy in a way that used to suffocate me but now only strengthened my resolve, and for a few seconds he didn't notice me, his attention focused on the room, scanning it with that same possessive gaze, as if searching for something he believed belonged to him. And then the lights came on, bright and sudden, cutting through the shadows and freezing him in place. And I saw it clearly then, the shift in his expression, the flicker of shock that he tried and failed to hide, because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the script he had written in his mind, and I stood up slowly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without fear, holding it in a way I never had before, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence thick with everything that had been left unsaid between us. Everything that had been buried under years of manipulation and control until finally he broke it, my name leaving his lips in a tone that was equal parts disbelief and irritation, as if my presence here, strong and unyielding, was an inconvenience to him rather than a reality he had to face. And he took a step closer, his posture shifting into something more familiar, something that once would have made me retreat instinctively, but I didn't move, I didn't give him that satisfaction, and instead I let him come just close enough to see the change in my eyes, the absence of the fear he relied on. And when he spoke again, trying to mask his unease with a casual tone, saying he was just checking on me, that he wanted to make sure I was okay, I almost laughed, because the lie was so transparent now, so weak compared to the truth I had already seen with my own eyes. And I shook my head slightly, my voice calm but edged with something sharper, as I told him that breaking into my house wasn't concerned. Was a crime, and his expression hardened at that, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the anger beneath the entitlement that had always been there. And he stepped closer again, his voice lowering as he said the words that once held so much power over me, that I was still his, that leaving didn't change, that I couldn't just walk away from something like we had. And for a brief moment I felt the echo of my past self, the part of me that used to believe him, that used to question whether I had the right to choose differently, but it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by a clarity that was stronger than anything he could say. And I smiled then, not softly, not kindly, but with a cold certainty that made him pause, and without breaking eye contact I reached for my phone and pressed play, the sound of his own voice filling the room as the footage began, showing him entering the house, moving through the space, speaking words he never expected to hear played back to him and I watched his reaction carefully, the way his confidence cracked, the way his eyes darted to the screen and then back to me, searching for a way to regain control of a situation that had already slipped beyond his reach. And when he demanded to know what this was, how I had this, I let the silence stretch just long enough before answering, telling him that he had recorded it himself, that his own actions had created the evidence that would end this once and for all. And for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to uncertainty in his expression, something that looked almost like fear, and it didn't make me feel powerful in the way I once imagined it might. It didn't bring satisfaction or triumph. Instead, it brought a quiet sense of closure, because this wasn't about hurting him the way he had hurt me. It was about stopping the cycle completely, about drawing a line he could never cross again. And as the distant sound of sirens began to echo through the night, growing louder with each passing second, his eyes widened in realization, the last piece of control slipping from his grasp as he understood what was happening, that this wasn't a conversation he could manipulate, not a situation he could twist in his favor. And he took a step back, his voice rising slightly as he asked if I had called the police, as if the idea itself was an act of betrayal rather than a consequence of his own actions. And I nodded, steady and unwavering, telling him that for the first time in my life I had chosen myself, that I had chosen safety over silence, truth over fear. And as the lights from outside flashed against the windows and the sound of footsteps approached the door, I felt something inside me finally settle, a long-awaited sense of peace that didn't come from running away but from standing my ground. And when the door burst open and everything that followed unfolded in a blur of voices and movement, I didn't look away. I didn't second-guess my decision. I simply stood there watching as the chapter of my life that had once defined me came to an end, not with chaos or desperation, but with quiet, undeniable finality. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I was free.